I think we're going to start. The title, as you can see, is Perspectives on Pollinators, Plantings, and a Passive House. Speaker is Dave Crawford. The host is us, the St. Croix Oak Savanna chapter of Wild Ones Native Landscaping. I'm Howard Marcus, a St. Croix Oak Savanna Wild Ones co-president, along with Roger Miller, and Roger and I are both Washington County Master Gardeners. A little bit of ground rules, so to speak. If you have questions for the speakers, send a chat to everyone. If there's problems with the program, the Zoom and the program, send a chat to the host. And as usual, please have your mute on and your video off. If you're not a member of the St. Croix Oak Savanna chapter of Wild Ones and would like to join, send a chat to Roger. I'm going to go to the next page for some bio and a program background. As a quick hint for me, after 3 years of Zooming, it's a lot easier for me to take photos than write information down. And then we'll have a final wrap up and question and answer and all that. So I'm going to go to the second page, and here's what Dave has provided for us to think about and get started.
But he can't move his fast because once it's on there, unless he's
So again, I can't see everybody, all the participants when I'm screen sharing. So again, please everybody mute and turn off your videos to save on bandwidth and things. Well, I think people have had time to look at the PowerPoint. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and then Dave's going to start sharing the screen.
Okay. And Howard, can you confirm that my first slide is up?
It is not up for me.
Okay. Oh, here we go. How's that?
Perfect.
All right. Then I want to say hello to everybody. And thanks for having me tonight. I'm going to talk about what the title says, Pollinators, Plantings, and Passive House, not necessarily in that order. And there's some explanation that's necessary if you're not familiar with Passive House. So that is, in fact, where I'm going to start. The house that my wife and I built, finished building about 3 years ago, has a working name, Lexington Parkway Passive House. And more on that as we go along. I'm also going to be talking about the native plant gardens that we've installed on the property. And in particular, the first step of that was installing rain gardens. That was part of the plan from the very beginning. But then following that, just last year in the fall, we did an additional project to landscape the slope that runs down to Lexington Parkway. And I'm going to also feature some pollinators. So that's the layout of the talk. Just to give you a layout of the landscape, Lexington Parkway is just at the bottom of the lot, down a hill about 14 feet from the elevation the house is at. That slope is marked here, and the house and the garage are marked. So you get an idea of what the lot looks like. It's pie wedge shaped and offers some really intriguing opportunities for landscaping and some challenges. The house itself is unlike anything else in the neighborhood. We were a little concerned about that at first. As we were planning it, are the neighbors going to think it's too garish or too rectangular or too odd? And so far, nobody has said that to us. And many people have said, "Ooh, I really like that fuchsia trim with that green siding," which kind of confounded our architect because he thought that it might be a little too loud. But he's grown into liking it, and he may feature it as a choice for future customers. At any rate, we're looking at the south facade of the house. You can see that there are many windows and they're large. One of the features of Passive House certified homes is that they harvest a lot of sunlight especially during the winter, as a way of reducing heating demand. Passive heating from the sun is the idea. So as we moved into this project, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we came to be here later, but right now the goals that my wife and I had for this project were primarily, first, low energy consumption, minimum operating cost in terms of CO2 emissions, net zero energy consumption if possible, which is a pretty high standard to meet in Minnesota's climate. We also wanted to design in order to be able to age in place. So the house is designed for as universal accessibility as was prudent for us. We could have gone way overboard with that, but we had a consultant who said, well, here are the things you really need, so do these first. We wanted to build the project using materials with reduced environmental impact. So not only our operating cost is going to be low CO2 emissions and low energy consumption, but the production of the materials for the house should also, as much as possible, meet that goal. We wanted ample natural light in all of the living spaces, which is easy to do when you have a lot of big windows. We wanted to use materials that were easy to maintain. So ideally, we hope not to have to do any major things like repainting or re-roofing during the time that we live here. And then outdoors, we wanted the best management for runoff retention. It's especially apparent to me that we should not be building homes and shopping centers and so on in such a way that all the groundwater has to be channeled away into storm sewers and end up in surface waters. We should be retaining as much of that runoff on the site as possible for the good of the site and also for the good of surface water. We wanted to be able to maintain a landscape with a minimum effort in terms of energy and time and material. We wanted the landscape to be beneficial, not just look nice to us, but provide habitat for wildlife and particularly for pollinators. And overall, we wanted to set a good example for others. We fully intended from the very beginning that part of why we were doing this project was to provide tours and outreach so that other people could see our example and learn from it. So, definition of passive house. It's a voluntary certification. Think of LEED Platinum, for instance, a very high standard of energy efficiency. Passive house calls for reducing the footprint, the ecological footprint of the building. Passive house compliant buildings have ultra low energy consumption, and the lion's share of energy consumption in this climate especially is space heating and cooling. So passive houses are designed to minimize the cost of doing those things. There are 2 organizations that certify passive houses, and they are separate from each other, although the Passive House Institute US is a descendant of the original, which the Passive House Institute. We have a live mic somewhere. Passive House Institute, which was originally established in Europe, and that's the standard that we built this house to. Our designer is TE Studio, principal architect Tim Ian and his partner Stefan Tanner, and our disability design was done by Slackner Design Studio. So a little bit more about why passive house matters. It's important to think in terms of what does the most good. Energy efficiency is as good as or better than not being efficient and using renewable energy. Ideally, you want to do both. The idea is that if you have reduced energy demand, you're going to have a reduced need for energy production, and that's going to have a number of snowball effects down throughout, there will be less need to build lots of transmission lines. There will be less need to occupy the landscape with large facilities for energy production, including solar. If we could reduce the amount of energy consumed in every building, we could get by with a lot less disturbance of the landscape and a lot less carbon problems as well. So how I got started on this is before I was married in the 1980s, I was planning a house in rural Wisconsin, which I ultimately built and called it Oak House because the siding and the sheathing and the subfloors were all made with rough cut oak lumber from a local sawmill. It was remainders. It was left over from batches that people had not purchased all of the wood. And so I got it at a very good price and built a house out of oak for a ridiculously low price per board foot. And used some salvaged windows and doors from other sources and put in some new windows. But the overall idea was to build a home that was kind of hobby level energy efficient. The first floor of that house backs up into a hillside, so there's insulation from outdoor air temperatures. And the south facade, which is what we're looking at, had a lot of glass so that it would bring in a lot of sunlight, with the result that I didn't have much in the way of heating needs during a good portion of spring and fall. In the hard winter, yeah, I did have to heat. So that was my initial experience, and I was very pleased with the results. And then when I got married, my wife wanted to live within the Twin Cities, and so I gave up on this house and we moved to a home that we chose in White Bear Lake, essentially a 1950s rambler with some upgrades. It had better insulation, and we put in triple pane windows, but it was not the dream of a really sustainable home that I wanted to live in as a life goal. And so we talked a lot while we were living there about eventually building the dream home, the very efficient home that would be ideal as a home for us and an example for other people. And what finally helped that gel was during my work as a state park naturalist, I was at a meeting that took place at the Concordia language camps near Bemidji, Minnesota. And we got a tour of the Valtze Biohaus Environmental Living Center, which was the first Passive House certified building, I think, in North America, certainly the first in Minnesota. We got a detailed tour, and it was apparent to me that this design standard had thought of everything. It thought about, okay, minimal heat loss. It thought about, okay, how do you get good air quality if you have a tightly sealed building? It was just an outstanding example of a way to build a building. And so that kind of gave me the idea that, all right, we could do this. And here's how we would do it. So then we kind of sat on that for a while, but ultimately decided, yes, we want to go ahead and do that. So right around 2011, 2012, we were searching. Oh, by the way, the designer for the Valtze Biohaus was Stefan Tanner, who we ultimately encountered as the partner of Tim Ian, our primary designer. So Passive House stands on 5 pretty critical steps: thermal insulation, passive house windows, and so on. But in general, instead of relying on fuel burning heating systems, the idea is to use passive heat gain and to minimize heat loss, or during the hot season, minimize heat gain. So all of those different pieces come together to do that. And I'm going to explain them in a little bit more detail. But first, around 2011, we were looking for a lot on which we could build. And we we're having a hard time. We wanted to live in St. Paul because we have some connections in St. Paul that are important to us. And it's hard to find a vacant lot in St. Paul. So we started looking at older homes with the idea that if we found one that was a real wreck, we would not feel bad about tearing it down and building something in its place. And what we ultimately found after months and months and months of looking was a house that wasn't a wreck. It was a 1948 Rambler that was in quite good condition, but it was selling for extremely low cost because of tax delinquency, I think. And so we invited Timmy in to come to the lot and give us his assessment of what's the solar energy potential for this location. And he said, it's great. And so we said, all right, let's start planning a house. And the house is oriented so that the widest face points due south, and solar input through those south windows is extremely effective during the leaf off season. So it fully meets the needs for a house site for a passive house to be able to harvest that passive solar energy. And then the next piece of the puzzle is those 5 qualities of a passive house, thermal insulation being one of them. I thought it was impressive when I built my house in Wisconsin to have walls that were insulated 12 inches thick. For this house, we ended up with walls 18 inches thick, insulated with dense packed cellulose, which is essentially it's a repurposed product, which has minimal to zero negative environmental impact and makes a really good insulation. Much better than the old way of just blowing in cellulose and not packing it densely, which tended to result in settling and many of the insulation cavities then not being insulated all the way up. So the walls are super insulated, and then really it's the entire building envelope, not just above ground, but below ground as well. So the frost footings, which are more than the bottom of them is more than 4 feet underground, they have a layer of expanded polystyrene foam insulation underneath them. So they actually sit on a layer of insulation. And it's pretty heavy duty stuff because it takes the weight of the entire house and doesn't compress. And then the stem walls, and that insulation under the footing has a R value of about R16, which is the same R value as a 6-inch thick wall insulated with fiberglass batting. And that's just underground, where most people don't even bother to insulate. But this is a passive house. It's got to be done this way. Otherwise, you don't get the certification. The stem walls were insulated on the outside with R32, so twice as thick as the insulation on the inside that was R16. So essentially the entire foundation of the house is encapsulated in foam insulation. The floor slab, we did not build a basement. We built a 2-story house with no basement so that we would have daylight in every room and solar intake in every room in the house. At least all the south-facing rooms. And then the wall, as I mentioned, 18 inches thick, R value of 55, which way above what I was able to do with my home in Wisconsin. And then the roof, we did a flat roof because it's more economical and simpler to build, uses less material. And that is insulated to R75 with dense packed cellulose again. And then the windows are an especially important feature because we have so many of them, for one thing. It is not possible to get a window that is good enough for a passive house in Minnesota unless you order it from Europe, because no manufacturer in North America, as of the time we built this house, was yet making windows that had the energy efficiency that passive house certification requires. And the next factor is airtightness. It's now policy in new construction to make buildings very airtight so that there's not any unmanaged exchange of indoor conditioned air with outdoor unconditioned air. And for us, we had actually 3 blower door tests done at different stages of construction, where the house was reduced in pressure a bit by exhausting air from the house. And that's what this red membrane with the fan at the bottom of it is for. You exhaust air from the house, and then you walk around and look for places where air infiltrates. Now, what we had as an airtight layer, if you look at the top left of this image, you can see in an oval tilted 90 degrees, there's the word Huber. That's the manufacturer of a system of house sheathing, which has an outer layer that's airtight. And the sheets of that material are sealed to each other with an airtight tape. So the entire house becomes essentially a balloon. Then, once you've depressurized the house a little bit, you look for places where cold air is leaking in. And with an infrared camera, you're looking for colors in the purple and blue range. Those are cold areas. You see that vertical bluish purple bar on the display near the right side. That's the frame of one of the windows. The window frames are probably the biggest energy leak. And then just to the left of that, inside that oval, there's a dark spot. That dark spot is where air is infiltrating through all of the 18 inches of the wall. Because of the way the wall was put together, there's always a few little gaps between elements that leak a tiny bit of air. And in order to make passive house certification, you look for every one of those little leaks and you plug them up. The idea is to get as close to zero air infiltration as possible. So in order to meet passive house certification, we had to have 0.6 air changes per hour at a pressure difference of 50 pascals. 50 pascals is a negligible pressure. It's like between 1 and 2/100ths of an inch on a typical barometric pressure. What we achieved was 0.38 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. So we definitely made it within the requirement for passive house certification. And to compare that with conventional construction, Minnesota code requires that all houses have to have less than 3 air changes per hour, 3.0 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. And we exceeded that by 7.5 times. We're 7.5 times more airtight than required by Minnesota code. And this is good because it will drastically reduce our heating and cooling costs. Another piece to reduce heating and cooling costs is avoid creating thermal bridges. For instance, having a structural element of the house that is exposed inside the house and exposed at its other end outside the house. Putting insulation around all of the concrete is one way to avoid that, but we had to go a step further. There's this notch along the side of the house where a door is going to be, and a typical outdoor entrance to a house has a sidewalk slab running up to it. And in conventional construction, that slab butts directly against the concrete foundation wall of the house, which means that it conducts heat from the entire length of that concrete slab to the foundation of the house and therefore into the house. And that's not allowed with passive house design. So there's an inset of insulation that separates the sidewalk slab from the house foundation. And that gets rid of that thermal bridge. Then the windows, as I mentioned, can't buy these or can't find them from North American manufacturers. They're a typical low E glass. Sunlight comes through, but the infrared re-radiation as that sunlight hits surfaces and re-radiates as heat, that heat doesn't go back out through the window with any ease. And the windows are triple glazed. They have inert gas in between the panes. They have triple seals on the windows that are operable. And they're extremely weather tight, extremely airtight. And they even have insulation elements built into the framing in order to keep the frames from being a really good thermal bridge. And they deliver a performance that's really amazing. We, in our first winter here, checked how the windows were performing one night when the air temperature outside was minus 25 Fahrenheit. And the inside surface of the windows measured above 60 degrees Fahrenheit with a contact thermometer. So the sensation standing next to the window was not, gosh, I'm standing next to a really cold window and I want to move away from it. It was more, this is really nice. This is extremely comfortable. We never get frost on the inside of the windows. We never feel a chill when we're close to the windows. We hardly ever even get any condensation on the inside of the windows. And that's a huge contrast with the triple pane windows that we had at our old house in White Bear Lake, which would frost up every night. And so we're very happy with the performance of these kind of hard to get windows. And then because the house is so well sealed, it requires air exchange. And you don't just want to suck in outdoor air and blow it indoors, because then you're blowing outdoor temperatures indoors. So there's an air-to-air heat exchange device. And these are in standard construction as well as in passive house. But the ones for passive house are extremely efficient. In fact, what we've got is not just a heat recovery ventilation system, it also is a humidity recovery ventilation system. So it will keep the house from getting quite as dry during the winter as houses usually do. And it'll keep it from getting quite as humid during the summer as houses often do. I'm not going to give you time to read all of that on the screen because I want to keep moving along. But I do want to say that the fresh air equivalent of having this system running, and it runs absolutely silently, and it moves air to and from every room in the house. The fresh air equivalent is the equivalent of opening all the windows in the house for a half an hour every 3 hours, which means the air quality in this house is probably a lot better than any house I've ever lived in, which is, and that's without sacrificing temperature because of a leaky house. Another factor in passive houses, you are not allowed to have any fossil fuel burning inside the house at all. That, for one thing, requires that you have an exhaust to get rid of the combustion products, and that compromises your airtightness. And you also need an intake to bring combustion air in to have flaming gas or flaming oil or whatever as a heat source. And so the house is heated and cooled entirely with electricity. We thought that we wanted to aim for net zero energy consumption. And so we asked for a solar array to be designed for the house, and it was placed on the flat roof. And it's designed to offset 100% of the energy, the electrical energy that the house uses in a typical year. That's a big job, but we thought, yeah, let's do it. Let's give it a try. Our installer for that was Impact Power Solutions. They no longer do residential installations. I think we were one of the last ones they did before they went entirely to commercial installations only. And the performance for this was exactly what we asked for. Looking at this graph, any bar that is below the center line of the graph is energy that we produced in excess and sold to Xcel Energy at a slightly higher cost per kilowatt hour than the energy we bought from them during those months when the bar goes up instead of going down. And the total kilowatt hour production excess came out as almost identical to the total kilowatt hour purchase that we had to make during those colder months. So we came out at net zero. Our electric bill for the first 12 months that we were in this house, running everything, heating, cooling, appliances, lighting, stereo, everything, was about $150 for the entire 12 months. So like $12 a month is what it costs to operate this house. Meanwhile, the solar utility, there's an app that you can look at on a cell phone or a computer that shows you how your solar panel system is performing. And right up to the end of January of 2023, we had produced 30 megawatt hours of energy and saved 47,000 pounds of CO2 emissions and planted the equivalent of 357.5 trees. And then, whoops, there we go. It's taking a moment to bring this up. We got our Passive House certification from the Passive House Institute in Europe. And we ended up, because of the solar panels offsetting all of our energy consumption, we ended up receiving Passive House Plus certification. What that means is that the house does offset its energy consumption, most of it, in our case, virtually all of it. And that's an extra bonus. It's like, okay, we're trying for net zero, and we made it. So we ended up being the first certified passive house built in the city of St. Paul. And we also ended up being only the second house in the United States to get Passive House Plus certification. So we are definitely early adopters of technology. And we did this because we wanted to be part of that group of people that inspired others to think about doing the same thing. There's really a lot of good reasons why all new construction should be this energy efficient. And the cost of doing this is not all that expensive compared to conventional construction. If we had gone for a house that wasn't built with special features for disability accessibility and other special features, if we had just built an average floor plan house and we built it to Passive House certification standard instead of to code, we would have paid between 12 and 15% more to make it Passive House certified than it would have cost us to make it code compliant. That's not a whole lot. So it is definitely within the reach of a lot of people who are considering new construction. So we're happy with what we got. And then as far as accessible design, we all of our entryways are at grade level. So there's no stairway going into the house. It's just roll right in if you need to, or wheel in with your walker, or walk in with your cane, or whatever. There's no barriers to getting in and out of the house. And we have on our balcony level, whoops, on the way to the entrance of the house, we decided we would border the garden with a railing so that people who are unsteady on their feet, which may include us in a few years, have something to hang on to so that it's relatively safe to get in and out of the building in all conditions. And then on the second level, we have a rollout balcony so that we can get outside at an elevated perspective, which is a real desirable thing for me in particular, having lived in rural Wisconsin and having had a place where I could stand up high and look out over the landscape. And then another feature is that from the get-go, we said we're going to have an elevator in the house. Even if we don't use it, we'll use it as a closet if we have to, but we're going to build the house with an elevator already in it. So if there's any change in our ability to navigate on our own 2 feet, we have the means in place to be able to do that. And in fact, we have used the elevator mainly as a closet. Although we have had guests who have mobility impairments, and we have been really glad that we could take them up to the second floor. As far as other accessibility features, the hardware on all the doors and all the windows and all the cabinets is ADA compliant. So it can be operated by a person who has even very severe arthritis or other difficulties with manipulating objects. And all of the hallways, all of the doorways, all the room dimensions are wheelchair compliant. So there should be no barriers to us continuing to live here, regardless of our physical condition. Moving on to reduced environmental impact materials, the first thing that we did in that regard was to consider, what are we going to do with the house that's already on the lot? We didn't want to simply demolish it and have it all be chucked into a landfill. So we hired a company to disassemble it, to deconstruct it. And the result of that was that all of the materials were taken apart and sorted and sent to various destinations where they could be repurposed. So all of the concrete, for instance, from the chimney and the foundation and the slab was ground up and used as aggregate in new construction, as aggregate for new concrete. 70% of the material in the house ended up being repurposed. Fair amount of lumber that was salvaged ended up going to Habitat for Humanity and also to the Franconia Sculpture Park up on the St. Croix River. And we reserved a small amount of the wood to do some interior paneling in our workroom. So we were reusing parts of the original house. And then for new wood, we specified that we wanted Sustainable Forest Initiative certified wood. And that's Sustainable Forestry Initiative. That's a project that certifies forest product producers in a way that minimizes or avoids negative social, environmental, and economic impacts. It's not as strict a program as FSC, which I can't remember now what that translates, Forest Stewardship Council. Anyway, it's less strict than that. And it's kind of an in-between. For us, it was, well, the cost would be extremely high if we went with FSC certification. So let's step down one and we'll do SFI. And fortunately, anecdotally, we got the house built just before the prices of lumber started to skyrocket, because everybody was building during the early stages of COVID. So we got our timing down pretty well. We didn't know that at the time, but we're glad that we did. We also were aware that concrete is a big CO2 releaser. During the production of concrete, you have to convert limestone into Portland cement, and that releases a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide. So our designer specified that the concrete used on the project would be minimal content of Portland cement and as much content of fly ash instead, a waste product from coal burning, essentially. Fly ash concrete is stronger than Portland cement concrete. You still need some Portland cement in it. It doesn't set up quite as fast, but once it sets up, it's stronger. And it has a vastly reduced carbon footprint. For siding, we ultimately went with steel panels. We wanted something, because we had the stipulation, we want low maintenance. Steel panels seem to be a good choice for that. And in terms of environmental impact, a steel panel is going to last a lot longer than many other types of siding. So it's not going to have to be replaced as often as many other types. And steel paneling is fully recyclable. What I didn't do during construction was to ask, so is the source of the steel that is being made into these standing seam panels. Is the source recycled steel or is it fresh virgin steel? And I don't know the answer. If I had been paying attention to that, we would have specified recycled steel. And then the accent siding is a heat-treated ash, which is essentially the waste product of cutting down ash trees that are dying from emerald ash borer. There wasn't a big demand for that type of wood because it wasn't very weather resistant. However, someone discovered that if you bake it at a modest temperature for a short time, it becomes much more weather resistant. And it then is a siding that doesn't require any kind of stain or oil or paint or anything. You just let it weather in place and it should last for many, many decades. For the interior, we used sheetrock, and for floor coverings, the master suite has wool carpeting with a natural jute backing rather than a synthetic petroleum product backing. The majority of the floors are cork, which is sustainably harvested. You can basically take a layer of cork off of a cork oak every 10 years, and that cork oak may live to be 180 years. So it's going to produce many, many, many square feet of cork over its lifetime. We used marmoleum in the kitchen and the workroom. That's just a brand of linoleum. Linoleum is plant-based, made from renewable materials, and it's fully biodegradable, so it can be recycled into whatever at the end of its service life. And for high traffic areas and wet areas, we used ceramic tile. Just as an aside, we also insulated our garage, not because our cars needed to be warm in the winter, but because we were thinking in terms of, as time passes and as society changes, it might be really handy to have an extra space that we can condition by heating and cooling if we want to. And so we went the extra distance and insulated the garage. And our designer said, yeah, what you've just done is build a garage that meets the residential code standards for single family dwellings. It doesn't meet passive house standards, but it's kind of eye-opening that what we thought of as, oh, we'll just do this as a side project, ends up equaling what code requires for energy efficiency, which tells you that code is a long way behind cutting edge right now. We get lots of natural light and the passive solar heating that I mentioned. So this is a view looking east in the combined living room and dining room with the south-facing windows on the right. And you can see this was shot during winter with snow in the background, and the sunlight spills across a good chunk of the floor and releases heat. We also have an incredible view. This was a fringe benefit. The house is located right across from Como Golf Course. We were not looking for a great view. We were looking for a good solar exposure, but the lot also has a great view. And our designer said, well, as long as you've got a great view, you should take advantage of it. So he talked us into doing these walls of windows from top to bottom. That, however, is a potential death trap for birds because window collisions are a major cause of mortality in birds. And so those windows have a coating on the outside pane, which human eyes really can't see, except if you have the right conditions and you get at just the right angle. You can see that there's this kind of crisscross jackstraw pattern, which you barely notice, but which for birds, because they can see ultraviolet pigments, birds see this as like a giant spider web and they avoid it. We've had virtually no bird collisions on those windows. We don't have that coating on all of our windows, and we have had some mortality on other windows, and we're thinking about retrofitting those with an exterior film that will contain ultraviolet markers that will prevent birds from thinking that they can fly through. There is one problem with having windows that face east and west. And that is that during the warm season, when the sun is taking a higher path through the sky, it's beaming full on at the east end of the house in the morning and the west end of the house in the evening, and it's producing a lot of passive solar heating, which you don't want during summer. So part of passive house design is a requirement that you have exterior metal shutters which can be closed to block off any unwanted heat gain. And that's what that shutter was. Now, the plantings, I'm going to talk first about our rain gardens. The plan from the very beginning was to install 4 rain gardens and to pipe all of the runoff from the house roof and the garage roof to those rain gardens, and to grade the site so that the entire building site from the house all the way back to the street on the right-hand side would drain into those rain gardens. Because, as I said earlier, we don't want runoff from our property adding to the load of nutrients that goes into Como Lake, for instance, or any other waterway. We also, recognizing that the driveway was a very large area of concrete that's impervious to water, we knew there was going to be a lot of precipitation runoff from the driveway. And we started out with the idea of, let's do a permeable paver driveway. And we looked at other permeable systems and then found out that City of St. Paul requires that for some distance, like 12 feet from the existing curb edge, you have to have a concrete slab. You cannot, or asphalt. You have to have one or the other. You can't have a permeable surface there. So that, plus the fact that a permeable paver driveway requires annual maintenance. You need to pressure wash the gaps between the paving blocks to remove the fine silt that accumulates and blocks water from penetrating. So instead of doing a permeable driveway, we did a driveway with a trench drain that all the driveway slab slopes toward that trench drain from the garage and from just almost from the curb. And all of the water that goes into that trench drain ends up being conducted underground to the south rain garden, the big rain garden in this image. And we've been very satisfied with that system so far. This year was unusual. We've had this tremendous snow cover. And then, of course, we had warm weather earlier this month, and we had a lot of melt. And water pooled up in the driveway on top of that grading because the trench drain was frozen. But then, because we had such unseasonably warm weather for so many days in a row, the trench drain thawed out and all the water drained off the driveway. So we don't have a skating rink on our driveway, which was something we knew we might have to put up with. But we, at least this year, we got lucky on that. Then there's the problem of, okay, so we've got runoff controlled on the building site, but what about the slope that runs down to Lexington Parkway? And we did nothing with that at the beginning, but starting in 2022, we did a project to take care of that particular issue. And I'll get into that as we get a little farther along. Wanted to show you first step of the rain gardens. 2020, when we moved in, I planted plugs. Some of the plants flowered. It was very nice to see. The next year, 2021, things had filled in a lot more. 2022, it had filled in even more. And we got a response in the form of, well, we started getting visits from more different species of pollinators than we had been seeing on the property before construction and during construction. So lots of different bees, wasps, flower flies, butterflies and moths, beetles, the whole works. And I'm not going to do much detail on those. What I want to do is say that this gave us a real opportunity to document the results of changing a turf grass lot into a native plant garden lot. So when we were building, and during a good chunk of the first year and second year that we've lived here, we had a typical turfgrass lawn that offered some floral resources to pollinators, Dutch white clover, dandelions, black medic, all of the things that True Green Chemlawn calls weeds. And we were attracting pollinators, but the pollinators were almost exclusively honeybees, which from a native pollinator perspective, you could also call European honeybees weeds, because they compete with the natives for floral resources. And they don't do as good a job of pollinating native plants as the native bees do. So we knew that we could improve on that. And I started keeping track. So for the first 2 years during the time that the house was being built, I was looking for pollinators and I was photographing them and documenting them. And in those first 2 years, 2018 to 2019, I counted 6 different species of pollinators: turfgrass lawn, clover, dandelions, not much appeal. After we got the rain gardens planted, even though the plants were small and they didn't have very many flowers, we ended up with 34 species of pollinators, a big jump in just 1 year. And the following year, with the plants much more mature and producing many more flowers, we were up to 88 species of pollinators. Some of that might have been, I don't know, hearsay, recommendations. It's like the insect world's equivalent of Twitter. Hey, there's this yard opposite Como Park. You ought to go there. The restaurant's really good. And then 2022 was, at first glimpse, a little disappointing because I only counted 85 species and I had been hoping, oh, we're going to see a continued rise. Well, okay, remember that the summer of 2021 and the summer of 2022 were both drought summers, and droughty soil is harder to burrow in for insects. And so I think we may have lost some of the species that had been hanging around when the soil was moister and easier to work. And actually looking at the details, even though we had fewer total species in 2022 than in 2021, 24 of those species in 2022 were first-time occurrences here. So we were attracting additional diversity of species, even though some of the species we had seen before we didn't see again. And I'm going to be very interested in 2023 to see, okay, do we start an upward trend in total insect species visiting flowers once again? A few of the firsts that were especially notable in 2022, one of them was a behavioral thing. I had never before seen an ant guarding a flower in order to keep all of those floral resources for itself. But we had ants that were chasing sweat bees off of our wild geraniums. And we had a butterfly show up that is not typically seen this far north. This is a type of skipper called a sachem or sachem. They're typically, the northern edge of their range is pretty much the Minnesota-Iowa border, but there were a lot of sachems in Minnesota in 2022, and some of them came to us. This one in the foreground is a male, and he's got his wings spread, so he's displaying his flashy colors. And he's doing that because right in front of him, there's a female, and he's kind of hoping that she'll notice him. And we had another butterfly from further south that also came in. The American snout is another one that gets into the southern edge of Minnesota, but not so much this far north. I think this is the first time I've seen one in my life, and certainly the first time I've seen a sachem in my life. And one other highlight for me was seeing the first jagged ambush bug. Now, many people who love pollinators are going to say, wait a minute, you love something that eats pollinators? I do, because the goal of a native plant garden for me is not just attract pollinators. It is build a stable and sustainable and complex ecosystem. And an ecosystem that contains no predators is not exactly sustainable, and it's not particularly complex. So I predict that the longer we have our gardens established, the more predators we're going to see showing up, because they're taking advantage of the higher concentration of pollinators and other insects that are attracted by the native plants. And they help to make the ecosystem more complex and therefore more resilient to change. So I count that as a success. We also had other critters that adopted our yard as a place to live. So chipmunks, rabbits, mice, shrews, all sorts of things. And we're happy about that. Then planning for what else to do. Besides the rain gardens, we put in one prairie garden along the sidewalk to the front door, and really appreciate seeing all of the critters that come and use that garden. And we put in a woodland garden down the slope in a spot that had shade from a plantation of non-native crabapple trees, but they flower nicely and they do attract some bees, so we're leaving them there. But then we were thinking, okay, we can do more. And so in 2021, I planted a number of wildlife shrubs, some American elderberry, a button bush, an American wild plum, a downy Juneberry, snowberry, a handful of other things. And also I planted a black cherry tree, not just for the floral resources that attract pollinators and the berries, which attract birds, but the foliage of black cherry is second only to oaks in attracting caterpillars. And caterpillars are the mainstay food for songbirds that are fledging. And so since there's already oaks in the neighborhood and there's not so much black cherry, I thought, all right, we're going to put in a black cherry. It's only like 2 feet taller than I am right now, but it's going to keep growing. And then we took a look at that slope down to Lexington Parkway and how it was a very large area, like half of the lot's total surface area is on that slope. Very large area of regularly mowed, compacted, ecologically pretty much blah turf grass. It doesn't hold runoff well. A turf grass lawn sheds water almost as effectively as a slope made of concrete. And it doesn't provide much in the way of ecological services, although the soil is there. And so insects can burrow into it. And there are some earthworms, but we can do better. And it's also terrible to mow on a slope. I hate mowing lawns anyway. So why make it even harder on myself by having to have a lawn on the slope? So we hired Diane Hilscher as a design consultant to design us a landscape for that hillside, which would incorporate native plants and get rid of the turf and also give us accessibility much better than walking up and down a hillside. As we age, we're not going to have as good balance. So we're going to need to be able to get up and down that hillside with a little help. And the help comes in the form of that green ribbon zigzagging across this illustration. That is a path that is wide enough for a wheelchair, and it sits at a grade that is ADA compliant for wheelchairs. It's not hard surfaced, so it doesn't meet ADA compliance in that respect, but we can always retrofit it with a geotextile covering that will support wheelchair traffic and still allow plants to grow up through it. And that has been sown with a mixture of blue grama and buffalo grass. We have relatively clayey soil, and buffalo grass does well on clay. So we have hopes that that mixture of grass is going to give us a relatively short stature covering over the path that maybe we'll mow it once or twice a year and otherwise not. And the entire rest of the project area is all native plants, some of them planted by seed, some with plugs. So this began in September last year. And before we started, this is what it looked like from street level, looking up the slope at the house. One feature here, I don't know how well you can see my mouse flickering back and forth, but that patch of woody stuff was essentially a lot of volunteer saplings of a wide variety of tree species, some of which we like and some of which we didn't. And the subcanopy layer was a a hedge of alpine currant, which is a European species whose flowers don't seem to produce any floral resources and don't attract any pollinators. And besides, they were planted in 1948 and they were reaching their use-by date. They were leafing out less and less. They looked really scraggly. So one of the first things that we wanted was for that to go away. We retained a few trees, as you'll see in the next image. And the other thing was kill off the lawn. And we had a landscaping company come in and do that for us. They used Roundup, or one brand or another of glyphosate, which, because they are used to doing this for people who want to plant native plants, they are really careful about applying it. And glyphosate is bad stuff, but if it's applied scrupulously, it's limitedly bad. And we didn't see any real future in trying to get a sod cutter and remove essentially 1.5 of an acre of sod on a hillside, or to blanket the entire hillside with black plastic and wait a year. So we went with the chemical solution. In addition, you see in the middle ground, 3 saplings standing up. Those are 3 hackberries, which we retained out of all of the clutter of sprouting tree saplings. And there was even an Amur maple in there, which was particularly objectionable because they are invasive. And we had a little bit of garlic mustard in there, which I, after 2 years, I think I finally got it to the point where there are no seeds left in the soil. Of course, now the soil's been stirred up quite a bit by this project, so we might see some new sprouts coming up. And then you can see in the foreground right that there's edging between our lot and the neighbor's lot, so that their turf grass will not creep over into our lawn. And some of the plants that we're putting in as natives will also try to creep into their lawn. So we're trying to draw a line there to keep things easy for both of us. And then we started with contouring. So this is the beginning of that ADA compliant pathway coming down the hill on the left and then going further down on the right and then zigzagging back once more parallel to Lexington Parkway in the background. This is what it looked like when all of the grading was done. Soil was stabilized in spots where it was steep. It was stabilized with a mat of Excelsior wood fiber. And then the next step was to have a vendor come in and plant designated seed mixes in designated areas, and then surface coat the entire area with hydromulch, basically a paste that's sprayed onto the ground. It's made from wood fiber, I believe. It kind of smells like peat moss, which is interesting because there isn't peat moss in it. And it's dyed green in this case, apparently because the manufacturer said, wouldn't it be nice for people to be able to green up their lawn just immediately? At any rate, the curb effect of that was, hey, instant lawn. And yeah, never mind that it's only a coat of paint and that it's going to be growing with all sorts of other things in the next growing season. We started doing this project late enough in the year that the seed vendor was saying, well, we want to be sure that the soil temperatures are low when we plant the seeds, because we don't want them to break germination, break dormancy, and then get hit with winter, because that'll kill them. So they wanted to plant the seed while the soil was cool enough that the seed would stay dormant until spring of 2023. And lo and behold, right after the hydromulching, we got snowfall in October, which melted off in a matter of a couple of days, but it was a good indicator that yes, this was a good time of year to plant seed that we didn't want to have sprouting right away. And then the snow melted off in a matter of a day and a half. And the next step was to have another vendor bring in a lot of container grown plants, 1,500 plus shrubs, forbs, and grasses. And in addition to that, prior to using glyphosate on this slope, I had gone out and I had salvaged as many flats of common blue violet and a little bit of, believe it or not, there was Pennsylvania sedge in one spot. How it got there, I don't know. And a little bit of self-heal. And I had transplanted a tiny colony of sandwort from our house in White Bear Lake to this house. So I salvaged that out of the lawn also. And so in addition to those 1,500 plugs, there were literally thousands of individual bare root plants of violets and sedge and those other species. So it took a planting crew of 7 people 2 days to install all of the plants. And I can't tell you what the results are going to be until this spring, but I'm hoping for really, really good results. I want to see this project mature over the next few years. And I know it's going to be a while before it looks as good as our yard in White Bear Lake looked after 25 years of native plant gardening. And we're not going to see the pollinator diversity that we had there. We had over 200 species documented in that yard, including rusty patch bumblebees. But we're slowly building up to that again. And how many of you, I'm going to ask this as if you can answer. I know you're all on mute, but how many of you have heard of Homegrown National Park, a project of Douglas Tallamy? We are on the map, so that reddish orange balloon in the top center, that's us. And there's a few others around us, but there's a long way to go. The statistics on that project right now are a goal of planting 20 million acres of urban and suburban landscape with native plants. And the percent of that that's been achieved so far is less than 1%. But 60,000 acres nationwide that's been enrolled in this program. And all of you who have native plants in your yards, you can enroll in this too. You can be on the map, you can contribute your acreage, even if it's in hundredths of an acre, it builds up. And it's free. There's no charge for getting registered on the map. And you become an inspiration for other people who are looking around for, oh, are there others in my neighborhood who are doing this? And they look on the map and they see you and they say, I think I can do this too. So here's another reason why we're really happy to be right here on Lexington Parkway. And that is we want to do educational outreach. And wow, we don't have to reach very far. There's 12,000 vehicles on average every day that travel this section of Lexington Parkway. And some of those drivers notice what's beside the road. They're especially, I think, they notice the house going up, and they notice it's still because it's really odd looking and bright colored. And they're gonna notice that it's not a mowed lawn landscape anymore as the years go by and it fills in. So we're doing outreach, we're being an example for people that they can do things like this too. We are going to be using signage to make sure that the message gets across. Although for somebody driving past at 30 miles an hour, they're not going to read the fine print, but at least they're going to know that it's an intentional pollinator habitat. So we are doing our best to be good examples for energy efficiency, accessibility, low impact construction materials, low maintenance, eco-enhancing landscaping. And we're also trying to be good neighbors, and it's working. Everybody likes us. We got invited to National Night Out 2 years before we moved into this house. We were already getting invitations from the neighborhood to come to National Night Out so that people could meet us. So we have a great community here. And some of them have picked up on the native plant theme. The people right across the street from us have put in a pollinator-friendly boulevard, and they're going to add even more plants to another part of their yard in 2023. So all in all, we're happy with this project. We're happy with the progress we're making. The only thing that's kind of a downer is COVID. Before COVID, during construction, we had 3 tours, probably 600 people total who came in, saw the house, got the information about why it was built the way it was, all about the energy efficiency, all about the potential for people doing this with new construction elsewhere. And then COVID hit, and we have not had any tours since we moved into the house. So we're hoping that in the future, we're going to be able to open the house to tours again. I'm already keeping a list of people to contact who drop by and say, I really like your house. Could I see inside it sometime? I get their name and their email address, and I'll send them notifications once we are ready to start having public tours. And with that, I'm going to open this up to questions. I'm going to leave this slide on the screen for a few moments just to give you these web resources. And Roger said he would also post these in the chat, so you can see an overview of construction and time-lapse construction videos. If you don't remember the web address, just go on YouTube and do a search on Lexington Parkway Passive House, and you will find it. And designers' information on the project, you can do a web search on TE Studio, and you will ultimately find Lexington Parkway Passive House on TE Studio's website. And with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing and ask for questions.
Well, Barbara has her hand up. I mean, Brenda has her hand up. Brenda? You're still on mute.
Sorry, I just raised my hand to say I would try to be on the map.
Oh, okay.
Very good.
Yeah, me too. Roger, why don't you take over the chat portion? I know there was a few comments and questions.
Roger is muted.
Or Roger.
There he is.
Yep, I'm back. And you had a question about, Dave, the total cost per square foot.
I don't have that figure. I'm going to have to fall back on that 12 to 15% more expensive than conventional construction. So I could give you total project cost, but it would not be meaningful because we spent an awful lot of money on extras. And it's not a good comparison with a conventional construction project.
Okay, Joanne, you have your hand up.
I'm here with Joe, and he has a comment.
We're just enjoyed your presentation enormously. We're in the midst of a project, something like this, out in Lake Elmo, building a net zero. And it's got 12-inch walls and R40 walls and R80 ceilings and so on. And we have a landscaping problem, light in the back with a slope down there. And Joanne has been doing some design work there. And we've taken a lot of screenshots off of your videos and appreciate that. So we'll be studying this and trying to learn from what you've done. Just wonderful inspiration. Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. I'm glad we can be an inspiration, and I'm glad you're doing your project.
So Dave, I don't know, at this point, can you see the chat? Can you work your way down?
Yeah, I could just pop it up and let me make the window bigger so I can see everybody's comments. So I see Barbara. This type of total recycling is required in Germany. Saw a 3,000 square foot house taken apart piece by piece, and the materials were all sorted into stacks of like material and then taken away and recycled. Yeah, that's a great option. There's we did not want to feel stigmatized as, oh, those people who tore down that house and put up their own. It's too much like building a mansion on a lakeshore after you wipe out the original 1940s lake house that used to be there. So we wanted to make sure that the house that was here before was reused as much as possible. And going on to the rest of that comment about the windows opening, sliders and so on. Yes, the windows that we have are dual opening. They can be tipped inward from the base, or they can be opened like a door hinged at the side. And so you can have them open tipped in during rainy weather, and rain won't get in the window because the walls are 18 inches thick and the windows are set well back in the wall. So rain just does not get to the top of the window. Or you can open them all the way and get a full draught of fresh air. And that also makes them compliant with the egress window code requirements for bedrooms, so that you can get in and out of the house through those windows if you have a ladder, since our bedrooms are all on the second floor. And then I see Roger reposted those references to the YouTube site and the TE Studio site, and Diane Hilscher's studio address as well. I see Howard Marcus says that they are enrolled in Homegrown National Park. And yeah, the thing about At Least I Tried, I had some trouble getting on the map. I don't think that the website design is as user-friendly as it really ought to be. And all I can say is I kept trying and I kept trying, and finally I did it. I don't have anything better to recommend. A source for heat-treated ash for exterior use. The company that we got ours from is called Arbor Wood, ARBOR Wood. And I'm not sure where they're located, but everybody's online now. So if you type Arbor Wood into a search engine, you will find them. We had a contractor who was the actual face-to-face contract with the vendors that supplied materials. So I can't really recommend the vendor on personal experience. All I can say is we've been living in the house for almost 3 years now, and we like the way that the wood is performing. Then St. Paul rules, 8 inches or shorter for lawn, and you can plant anything you want except invasives in your garden. Our defense, if we get a complaint from a neighbor that that the yard is rank, well, one of the first things we'll do is contact all the Wild Ones chapters in the Twin Cities area and say, hey, this just happened to us. Give us your ideas, because I think there's a lot of strength in numbers. And I'm recalling a post online about someone out east who was part of a homeowners association, and they were getting constant complaints about their naturalized landscape, including complaints that were completely specious, completely without, completely unwarranted. And what they ultimately did was to influence the state legislature to pass a law saying naturalized landscapes are legal and you can't tell people not to do them. So I'm not sure I'm up for that kind of a struggle, but I would be willing to look in that direction and say, all right, we need to reform the code for how lawns have to be maintained so that it allows a landscape that is quite obviously tended. We have a major path running through the middle of our landscape. We are deliberately planting shorter things close to the street. So for instance, right up to the curb is planted with the same grass mix, the blue grama and buffalo grass that is on the path. And right along the curb, if that gets taller than 8 inches, we'll mow it. And if we don't have to, if it never does get that tall, then we'll smile and say, gee, I'm glad I don't have to mow that.
Yeah, Dave, I'm gonna interrupt a second.
Sure.
For those who don't know, House File 734 by Representative Hansen is a new bill. Cities required to allow native landscapes on private land and vegetation overgrowth prohibited within cities. Right now, this bill is being discussed, and you can look it up. Again, it's House File 734, the 2023 legislature. And I encourage everybody to write letters of support for this bill. It will help, again, private citizens have a pollinator garden where they want it. without interference, major interference from cities. I mean, you can't have noxious weeds and things like that. So again, House File 734, I've been working on it and a lot of other people have been working on it, and they need all the support they can get because of course the cities aren't going to like it very much to lose control. So we need to buttress up the legislature to pass this. It might be a standalone bill, it might be an omnibus bill, but in any case, you need to look it up. You need to provide support however you can. So that's just a little plug from me. House File 734.
Thank you, Howard, for that plug, because I didn't know about that, and I will write a letter in support. And I hope that others will do the same.
Yeah, I think it came out of North Mankato originally, and all the harassment from that one gentleman down there who had a nice garden, and the city just harassed him. And finally, I think they finally gave up harassing him, but I think this was part and parcel of that harassment. But there's other people harassed all the time by cities, so
right.
We need some protection in our gardens.
Yeah, this is really good to know that this is being worked on right now in Minnesota. I'm glad to hear that. And then I see that there's a posting about how to get on the map for Homegrown National Park. That's at the bottom. Let's see, moving on. Can you have a basement in a passive house? Yes, absolutely. The only reason that we didn't is we wanted window light in every room without having to dig window wells to allow light into a below grade room. And the house is, I'm going to say, about 2,450 square feet. So it's not huge. It's we upsized a little bit. The Rambler that we were in White Bear Lake was 1,100 square feet per floor. So it had a full basement and a first floor, so 2,200 square feet. And we bumped it up a little for this house because we wanted hallways wide enough for wheelchairs and rooms big enough to turn wheelchairs around in. So we're still trying to stay on a fairly small scale. I know that if accessibility and aging in place had not been an issue, we could have built a house quite a lot smaller. There are some very small houses that meet passive house certification, and that is a way to go if you are at the stage in your life where you don't have mobility concerns. Then, being so airtight, are there any problems with passive homes and toxic mold, toxic building illness? There's not. There hasn't been anything that I've heard of with passive house in that respect. And one of the reasons you mentioned using non-toxic building materials, which is true, very good idea. Another reason why we have linoleum instead of a petroleum product, a vinyl flooring in our kitchen and workroom, is that linoleum doesn't outgas anything bad. The paint that we used is all low VOC paint. All of our furniture is essentially decades and decades old. It may have outgassed bad things when it was first made, but it's been outgassing for so long now that it's become antique. And then mold. Mold is really more of an issue when you don't have adequate ventilation, and when you do have a building that's designed in such a way that there's a spot where there's a cold surface against a moist interior and condensation builds up, oftentimes in a space behind a wall or inside a ceiling. And our designer for this house was very attentive to mold as an issue and said, he drew his construction plans to a level of detail that our contractor had never seen before, because he was very specific about, here's how you make this particular assembly where this patio balcony butts against the outside wall of the master suite so that you don't have any voids that are not protected by the vapor barrier. And so there's no place for moisture for moist air to leak into voids and create mold problems. So passive houses, if they're built correctly, should have better air quality than anything. Part of it being the construction design, part of it being the materials, and part of it being the ventilation system. External ventilation for the bathrooms. The way that works in a passive house is, no, there's not a dedicated exhaust fan in the bathroom that blows air to the outside environment. Instead, the whole house ventilation system takes air from the bathrooms and from the kitchen and from the workroom and from the laundry, where there's likely to be more humidity and likely to be odors. And it exhausts that air and extracts the heat from that air as it's exhausting it and transfers it to the incoming air, which goes into the rooms that are more actively lived in, like the living room, dining room, bedrooms. What you can do if you perceive that there's either a problem with odor or humidity is you can tell the whole house ventilation system to go into a faster, higher volume exchange mode. And actually, it includes in its machinery a humidity sensor that will do that automatically. So after we take a shower, for instance, we notice that the ventilation is boosted. So the house is having that moist air exhausted first and new air coming in to replace it. So that takes the place of a dedicated bathroom fan. That's all the questions that I see. And Brenda is saying thank you, and I'm saying you're very, very welcome. Barbara, recent transplant from San Diego native garden community. Are there talking points for file 734? That'd be a question for everybody who's involved in that effort. So Howard, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I've just sort of been watching and following. I believe that I don't know what's the best way. I think if you go to let me write down your email and I'll get back to you, because it's a little complicated. There's a lot of partners involved, a lot of people involved. So I need to figure out how to get you the information easily. I can give you, I'll put an email in the address in the chat right now. And this person has been tracking the legislation and knows all about it. And so I'm going to put his name in there.
Okay, and while you're doing that, Howard, I'm seeing thank yous from a number of people, and don't feel that you have to put thank you in the chat, because the fact that you're here is telling me you want to be here, and I'm very happy to see this turnout and happy to have been able to share these ideas and inspirations with all of you.
Okay, this is being recorded. It takes me about a week to 10 days because I have to send it to someone, and he has to do it and get it back to me, and he's very busy right now. And so it's not something that's going to happen tomorrow or the day after, but hopefully within the next week to a week and a half, I'll get a Facebook link to Roger, and he'll get it out to all of you.
Great. And I will share that on my own Facebook feed once I get it, and share it to Minnesota naturalists as well.
Good. This is the time. Are there any more questions? Any more thoughts? Everybody's been very patient. Dave, you've been extra patient. We really appreciate it, but there's been a lot of interest and a lot of good vibes.
Yep.
Okay. Let's see. Well, some thanks again. Yeah, and we'll get the recording out, and Roger's put the the email link to St. Croix .wildones@mac.com, things like that. And I put in the chriscowan@gmail.com if you have questions about 734. He is a fount of information about it. We'll know all about it and provide you information on who to contact and what to do next. My poor memory says that there's a House sponsor, but not a Senate sponsor. And so he may be looking for help in getting a Senate sponsor, but I'm not positive about that. And that's crucial. And so that's something else you might talk to him about. And I might be wrong, but I'd rather be conservative and say it needs a Senate sponsor. But this is really important. You know, my yard, I live in Woodbury, and initially my wife and I had city of Woodbury issues with our yard because it's mostly pollinator plants, and we got lucky, and eventually the city changed their ordinances to fit our garden. But not everybody's so lucky to have that happen. And so we do need this legislation, and we do need all the help in getting it passed, because there's powerful people that want to keep control. So, but anyway, Chris Cowan is a fount of information on this and can help, and he's looking for help too. So, you know, he's happy to answer questions, but he'd be happier if you were offering to volunteer, either to write comments or to help recruit senators and representatives.
And I see a question about native plant recommendations for clay soil. And I put in the chat my email address with an invitation to Katie to email me, and I can send out a list of plants that other people have shared with me that do well in their clay soil. And then also the manufacturer of the glass film, it's actually the window pane itself is made with that film as part of it. And the company is called Ornilux, and I've just put that in the chat. And Mikado is the product name as I recall it. But do a web search on Ornilux, and I think you will find what you need.
Well, this has been great, Dave. We really appreciate it. We all do appreciate it. And all your research is just making things so much easier for the rest of us to follow through.
And I can tell you that I appreciate being able to do this talk, because remember, one of our project goals was education and outreach. And here you all are. Thank you for coming.
Well, again, a number of us on this Zoom link are Master Gardeners also, and that's our goal also, is to spread all the education we can as far as we can. So this definitely meets our goals also. So we really appreciate it. So other thoughts, other questions before we give Dave a break and let him go? Okay, going once, going twice. Okay, I'm going to stop record. Well, okay, I'm going to stop recording and we'll just adjourn if that's okay with everybody. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Howard. Good work.
Okay.